everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today we are going to be talking about self-inserts in fiction. I tend to think that every writer gets one good juicy self-insert in their novels, most often but not always their first, and I want to talk about kind of the need for writing self-inserts, the good things about writing self-inserts, the bad things about writing self-inserts, and then some tips for how to not write self-inserts, which kind of brings us to, well, clearly it's not so great, but I don't want to rag completely on self-inserts because I really do think they have their place, especially with newer writers. This came up in my advice for teen writers video, which is why I decided to do a whole discussion topic on it, because I do think it is an essential kind of learning phase that a writer has to go through, which is inserting their whole self into a POV main character in their novel. Because the thing is, all writers insert pieces of themselves into their writing. That's the point. Part of writing, a huge part of writing, is putting ourselves on the page, putting aspects of our lives, our perspectives, things that interest us into books. But then the danger with something that's 100% a self-insert, like a single character, the POV character, is that it becomes an exercise in wish fulfillment, and it can lead to some real downsides overall in the rest of the narrative. Now, usually self-insert fiction doesn't ever get published, and we get to kind of get that self-insert out of our system, and no one has to read that tome of embarrassment. But not always. Sometimes self-inserts actually do get published, and I just wanted to share what I think are some funny kind of anecdotes of like why it can actually be a bad thing, and sometimes the best thing you can hope for is that your beautiful self-insert book doesn't get published. One of the reasons most self-insert books thankfully don't get published is that it is most common for an author to do this in their first ever completed novel. I think it's partly instinct because so many of us want to write books, to tell stories that we want to read, to go on adventures that we would want to take part in, to explore situations that we could never do or would never actually want to do in real life. And so there's kind of this gut instinct. It's the easiest well to draw on the first time that you're writing a novel to write someone who's just like you, because you're writing the story and viewing it through a lens that's super familiar to you because it's literally you. One of the reasons these books so often don't work is that, as I mentioned, self-inserts are essentially, it's about wish fulfillment. It's about putting a version of yourself on the page, usually the best version of yourself. When we create self-inserts, they're usually an idealized version of ourselves. It's the way we both are, but also the way that we want to be. And so one huge pitfall is that most often these self-insert characters don't have any real flaws, and we don't take any actual risks with these characters. We don't let anything bad happen to them. We don't let them make any real mistakes, which can lead to a novel that doesn't have enough conflict. You can also sometimes say that a self-insert is like a Mary Sue or a Gary Stu, and boy have we been having such fun pop culture conversations about Mary Sues lately, and I do not want to derail and go into a whole conversation about Mary Sues. But it is true that very often in fandom from whence I hail, when we would say, oh, it's a Mary Sue, it was definitely code for blatant authorial self-insert. It is really common, and the good news is that many of us get this out of our system when we do write fanfic, but it still beats through in a novel. Essentially, the idea of a Mary Sue, Gary Stu is this kind of larger-than-life character who has no flaws and is perfect in every single way and is wonderful and enters the narrative and then is like all the good things happen to them and everyone loves them. And that can definitely be the wish fulfillment that you get from a self-insert as well, though not all self-inserts don't have flaws. And actually some of the most interesting ones that do end up getting published, they do have flaws, but what's fascinating to me is that very often I can tell those authors don't see the flaws. They wrote someone so much like them that then they're gobsmacked when people say, oh, that character was really unlikable. And they're like, how could you dislike them? And I'm like, oh no, it's them. I actually have some legit stories where I realized the author wrote themselves and it was super duper awkward, which I'll come back to in just a second. But the final kind of reason or con why so many self-insert books don't get published, those first books especially, is that because we are so close to the source material, we feel so close to that main character and their feelings that we aren't able to effectively edit. it becomes a real barrier to critically engaging with the work and doing the editorial work that is often needed to make the characters more kind of fleshed out, to give them better arcs, to add more conflict, etc. So most self-inserts that people write, especially in their first books, are ultimately harmless exercises. They are learning experiences. I think we all have to vomit that self-insert out onto the page into a book. And then as we work on subsequent works, we have to work harder to pull away from that, because it would be really freaking boring if every single book you wrote, the main character was exactly like you. Even if you're not aware of having written a self-insert, and many authors aren't until much later. My first main character was definitely a self-insert, and I realized it later and was like, that's hilarious. So I was like, oh, I wrote me in high school. I see it now. But it is an essential learning process, and most authors tend to organically pull away from this because they don't want to repeat themselves when they write another book. They want to write characters who are different every time, so that it's a different challenge writing and a kind of a new reading experience. So most of us organically move away from this. But I'm going to hit you with some practical tips. But I want to give you some of the downsides of having a self-insert published. I have seen this with my own eyes. The first one is you end up taking criticism of the main character super, super personally. I have seen authors really fall apart and not being able to handle negative criticism of a character, things that people didn't like about the character, because they are so similar to them that it does legitimately feel like a personal attack. And we always say that, reviews aren't for authors, they're for readers, that reviews aren't personal, and they're not. They're not supposed to be. 99.9% of reviewers follow the rules, and reviews are not personal attacks, they're about the book. But if you are the book, if that character is you, it feels personal. But it's this messy thing where it's not the reviewer's fault that the character is you. They don't know that. They think they're responding independently to a piece of artwork. So it can be really dangerous. And then the other pitfall is ridicule. I've seen this as well, when readers have copped to the fact that the main character is very blatantly and clearly a self-insert. Well, they tease that author, usually not to their face, it's behind the scenes, but there are certain authors where we do snicker kind of in the background of like, well, they wrote their little self-insert there and they're going on their sexy romantic adventures, ooh. Or like the dude who clearly put himself in the book and gets all the hot chicks in the book. Like, we all raise our eyebrows at this and go, wish fulfillment, right? And then the third, real con that I don't think people think of is that it can legit change the way that people see you. If a reader meets you in person or gets enough of you from personal interactions and reads the book and doesn't like the character and realizes that they're a self-insert, that they are you, they might like you less. I have legit had my opinion of a couple of authors alter slightly because I read something that was so clearly a self-insert and I was appalled at the wish fulfillment. I thought it was just ridiculous, and I was like, if you're really like this, I don't know how I feel. Self-inserts can actually reveal very interesting personality tics and especially streaks of narcissism. So just be careful of how much of yourself you pour into any single character. I do want to throw out a few pros to self-inserts, and they're the same pros that you can get from generally injecting parts of yourself into your book, which you should be doing, just not unilaterally into one character all the time. As I mentioned, self-inserts are actually a good writing crutch for newer or less experienced writers, and I really do actually advocate. I think getting a self-insert out of your system is a good thing because it does kind of remove a lot of barriers to writing, especially the first book, because you know yourself really well and it's easy to write how you would react to things and what you would do. The other pro is that it really can lead to a super authentic reading experience. It's going to be very authentic for whatever you are authentic for. And many readers can then relate really strongly to whomever that self-insert character is if they kind of align with the type of person you are and your worldview. The flip of that again, though, is that if they don't and they say so, you're going to be really hurt. But it can definitely lead to some real authenticity in the reading experience. And finally, I'm going to give you some tips on how to not so much avoid writing self-inserts, but just some practical tips for you once you have written your fun, blatant self-insert on steps you can take on the next work to kind of spread the love and kind of avoid that blatant self-insert again, and to level up your fiction writing, level up your character development skills. So the first tip is to give your character, whoever it is, especially your main character, at least one trait that is the polar opposite of you. Something that you don't directly relate to, something that you cannot fathom experiencing or doing yourself. Give that to the character, because then it's going to challenge you and push you as a writer to really think about, well, what would this character, what would a person with this trait do in this situation? I wouldn't react this way, but they would probably do this. It's essentially expanding your kind of empathy, powers of observation of other people, psychology, etc., to create a character who is nothing like you in many ways. So this can mean maybe they're reckless. You're not a risk taker, but you decide to write a risk-taking character, which can actually be very great for conflict and plot progression. It could be, maybe you have a super thick skin about something. Well, maybe you write your character super sensitive. They cry more than you do, which can also lead to some conflict. Or vice versa. Maybe you are more sensitive, but you decide to go with a tough as nails character. Though, caveat there, always make sure they have vulnerabilities, because you don't want them to be one note. Whatever the thing is, giving that to your character is going to challenge you as a writer. And even if you don't nail it perfectly right out the gate, you can continue to refine and challenge yourself in revision to make it feel more authentic. The next tip is to give them a hobby or an interest that you do not have. Another thing that you see a lot in self-inserts is that the reason they feel so self-inserty is that they literally are just like the author. They have all the same interests, all the same habits. And so again, to kind of break away from that, it's like, okay, I know nothing about sports. They're gonna play a sport, and you're gonna have to dig deep down inside of yourself to go, okay, what drew them to that sport? And how does the mechanics of like playing and practicing that sport impact their schedule and their life? How does it change their personality? So it forces you to do that character work, to think outside of yourself, to craft something fresh and different on the page. Next, you're gonna wanna watch out for the physical characteristics of your characters. So another place where people get authors and self-inserts is when the characters, particularly the main characters, look exactly like them, where it's like a checklist of physical characteristics and that character meets every single one of them. So the author is blonde, the character is blonde. The author has beautiful green eyes, the character has beautiful green eyes. The author is 5'6" and slim, and the character is 5'6" and slim, and so on. So you're gonna wanna think about the physical characteristics of that character and switch it up a bit. Give them a different hair color, different eye color, a different build from you. Though, my note on build, to my lovely shorter lady friends writing, if you decide to write a tall character, you should. It's different. You don't see it a lot. Being a tall woman does impact how you walk through the world, or being a larger woman, and so on and so forth. Always be thoughtful and empathetic when you're writing something really far outside of your experience. I mean, this goes for anyone. And just kind of, ask a friend. If you have a tall lady friend, ask them how their height impacts them. If you are a taller, average height person, write a really short character and think outside of your own experience to make it authentic. There are lots of different things you can do. But just make sure they don't look exactly like you. That's all I'm saying. Same goes for your love interest, by the way. I've definitely caught a few examples where the love interest in a book looks exactly like someone's husband or significant other, or even an ex. I've caught that once or twice, and it's super awkward if you know the author. So just generally be careful of striking resemblances to people that we know in real life. And lastly, the last tip is basically to take all of these aspects of yourself, both your best and your worst aspects, by the way. Gotta be a soul searcher when you're a writer. Think about all your strengths and your flaws and your hobbies and interests and tics, and spread them out to all your different characters. You are Katie at the end of Mean Girls, and you're breaking up the crown and you're throwing it to everyone. Everyone shares the spring fling crown. give lots of different pieces of yourself to lots of different characters. This is what writers do. This is really just writing 101. This is what you should be doing when it comes to writing and character development. Pinning pieces of yourself to different characters, but a single piece of yourself does not a whole character make. And then it's bringing in the opposite traits, the traits that complement that but that you don't share, the different hobbies, and you are basically crafting all of these different characters who have a spark of familiarity from yourself, but who require more development beyond just who you are. That's how you create whole, interesting characters. And I will link you down below to my developing characters video. I've also got one coming up on character agency and growth, which kind of factors in here. But really, the whole topic of self-inserts, it's a matter of kind of acknowledging that it is a necessary crutch for newer writers, I feel, but that to become a well-developed and good writer, you have to learn to develop characters who exist outside of your specific thoughts, feelings, and experiences. Writing is ultimately an exercise in empathy. And also, just as a little note, specifically, I wish people would rag less on teenage girls, on young women for writing blatant self-inserts. I think that's one of the beautiful things about fiction, especially fan fiction, that women get to have wish fulfillment fantasies. I think they're healthy, I think they're good, and they stem from a place of so many women not seeing themselves in fiction and media as much. So again, this is why I support people writing self-inserts. But give yourself one go. You get one blatant self-insert in a novel, and then move beyond that. So those are my thoughts on self-inserts, and I'm curious to hear what you think, because I think this is one where everyone's gonna have a slightly different opinion. I also want to know, have you guys gotten your self-insert out of your system? Give this video a thumbs up if you like it, and I will make more videos that are like part discussion, part practical tips for topics in writing. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, guys, happy writing.